might be learning more from listening than Doctrine allowed. There was no immediate response to his observations. Logs were filed, reports archived. The machinery of war moved forward, relying on established systems that had worked well enough so far. Yet within the quiet of the signals room, the sense grew that open airwaves carried unintended signals, and that someone on the other end was paying close attention. By the beginning of 1942, the operational environment surrounding Allied communications had grown more demanding. The United States had entered the war, expanding the scale of coordination required across the Atlantic. New units, unfamiliar with European conditions, were integrated into existing networks. Radio traffic increased not only in volume, but in diversity, as different services brought their own procedures and assumptions. Official doctrine continued to emphasize encryption's strength. Manuals and briefings reassured commanders that encoded messages protected operational intent. Less attention was given to the metadata of transmission: timing, frequency choice, duration, and repetition. These elements were treated as secondary, largely unavoidable characteristics of radio use. The coastal monitoring station remained active day and night. Shifts were extended, and operators were rotated frequently to manage fatigue. Equipment was upgraded incrementally, but procedures remained largely unchanged. Schedules were fixed to maintain predictability within Allied forces, even as that predictability extended outward into the ether. The signal specialist found that the patterns he had previously noted were becoming more pronounced. Certain frequencies drew rapid enemy reaction, while others remained quiet. Attempts to adjust transmission power or switch bands often produced temporary relief, followed by renewed interference. These observations suggested not random interception, but sustained monitoring. Reports from naval commands reinforced this impression. Convoys suffered losses in areas where no visual reconnaissance had been reported. Post-action assessments often cited bad luck or enemy patrol density. Rarely did they connect outcomes directly to radioactivity, despite the temporal proximity. Within intelligence circles, some analysts began to acknowledge the possibility that enemy signals units were exploiting Allied habits. Internal memoranda hinted at concerns over predictable schedules and standardized procedures. However, these documents competed with optimistic assessments that emphasized technological superiority and numerical advantage. The specialist's logs grew more detailed. He tracked not only his own station's transmissions, but also those relayed through shared frequencies. He noted how quickly enemy jamming appeared after certain call signs became active. He observed that even minor deviations from routine sometimes coincided with reduced enemy response. These findings were shared during a regional communications review. The meeting was technical in tone, focused on equipment performance and staffing. When the issue of interception arose, it was framed as an external threat rather than an internal vulnerability. Responsibility was diffused across departments, making decisive action unlikely. Operational pressure increased. In preparation for future offensives, commanders demanded constant updates and rapid coordination. Radio silence was discouraged, except during specific phases. Any reduction in communication was seen as a risk to control and safety. The specialist encountered quiet resistance when he suggested more flexible scheduling or deliberate variation in transmission habits. Such changes, he was told, could confuse friendly units and undermine efficiency. The system valued clarity and consistency above experimentation. Meanwhile, enemy interception capabilities continued to improve. German listening stations expanded coverage, refining their ability to classify Allied transmissions. They relied not solely on cryptanalysis, but on traffic analysis, building profiles of units based on behavior rather than content. Loss reports accumulated. Each incident was investigated in isolation. Patterns that emerged over time were difficult to address within a structure designed to respond to discrete events. The gap between operational reality and doctrinal assumptions widened. The specialist's role became increasingly constrained. He was aware that his observations pointed toward a systemic weakness, yet he lacked both the authority and the institutional support to act on them. His work remained focused on accurate transmission and diligent logging, even as the implications of those logs grew more troubling. By late 1942, the sense of limitation was clear. The machinery of communication functioned smoothly on the surface, but beneath it lay vulnerabilities that Doctrine had not fully confronted. The airwaves carried more than messages. They carried patterns, habits, and signals that an attentive enemy could exploit. In early 1943, Allied planning entered a more assertive phase. Operations in North Africa were concluding, and preparations were underway for expanded actions in the Mediterranean and beyond. These plans depended heavily on coordination between air, naval, and ground forces spread across wide geographic areas. Radio communication was not simply supportive, it was foundational. Within this environment, pressure on signals personnel intensified. Timetables were tighter, reporting requirements more detailed. The expectation was constant availability. Any delay or deviation was scrutinized. The system rewarded compliance and reliability rather than adaptation. The signals specialist remained at his post, now with nearly 2 years of continuous wartime experience. His familiarity with the soundscape of Allied radio traffic had deepened. He could distinguish units not only by call signs, but by pacing, operator rhythm, and habitual phrasing. This sensitivity, developed through repetition, sharpened his awareness of how exposed those same habits might be to an adversary. A turning point came not through a single incident, but through accumulation. Over several weeks, he noted that enemy responses were no longer merely timely, they appeared anticipatory. Interception was occurring not after transmissions, but in parallel. Frequencies were challenged almost immediately. Enemy units seemed positioned in advance of expected Allied movements. This realization altered his perspective. The problem was no longer one of isolated compromise. It suggested that listening was continuous and systematic. The enemy was not reacting to content alone, but to presence. Every transmission announced itself. Official channels remained cautious. Intelligence summaries acknowledged interception in general terms, but avoided conclusions that would require broad procedural change. The prevailing assumption was that encryption failures would be identifiable and correctable. Traffic analysis, by contrast, was harder to define and therefore easier to downplay. The specialist decided to adjust his own conduct within the narrow limits allowed. Without altering codes or violating orders, he began to vary transmission timing when possible. He adjusted pauses, altered the sequence of routine acknowledgments, and recommended slight shifts in frequency usage during low-priority traffic. These actions were subtle enough to avoid notice, but deliberate in intent. The effects were modest but noticeable. On days when routines were less predictable, enemy interference appeared delayed or absent. The correlation was imperfect, but it reinforced his belief that habit itself was a liability. This quiet adjustment carried risk. Deviation from standard procedure, even minor, could be interpreted as error. The signals specialist documented his actions carefully, framing them as technical adjustments rather than strategic choices. He avoided drawing attention, aware that open challenge to Doctrine could end his role. His observations began to align with similar concerns emerging elsewhere. Fragmented reports from other stations suggested that enemy listening was more effective than previously assumed. However, these insights remained dispersed, lacking a unifying framework that could translate into policy. The personal cost of this realization was restraint. The specialist understood the vulnerability but could not fully address it. He operated within a system that prioritized uniformity, even as uniformity increased exposure. The risk was not dramatic, but persistent. By mid-1943, the unofficial adjustments he had made remained local and reversible. They did not alter the broader operational picture, yet they marked a shift in his role, from passive operator to cautious observer acting at the margins of Doctrine. The airwaves remained crowded. Messages continued to flow. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy listeners remained attentive. The balance between communication and concealment had not been resolved, but it was no longer invisible. By late 1943, the consequences of earlier communication practices had become harder to dismiss. Allied operations were expanding in scale and complexity, particularly in preparation for future landings in Western Europe. The requirement for coordination reached levels not previously experienced. At the same time, losses attributed to enemy anticipation continued, even when encryption standards appeared uncompromised. Within senior commands, discussions about radio security began to shift in tone. Briefings acknowledged that interception was not limited to message content. References to traffic indicators and operational signatures appeared more frequently in internal documents. These terms, however, remained abstract for many decision-makers, disconnected from the daily routines of operators and units. The Signal Specialist Station received updated guidance that emphasized discipline rather than flexibility. Operators were reminded to follow prescribed schedules precisely and to avoid unauthorized deviations. The intent was to reduce confusion during large-scale operations, but the effect was to reinforce predictability at the very moment predictability posed risk. Tension emerged between technical staff and administrative oversight. Equipment officers focused on hardware upgrades and encryption tables, while operators continued to observe behavioral patterns that technology alone could not conceal. Reports highlighting these concerns were often acknowledged but deferred, pending higher-level review. The specialist found his earlier adjustments increasingly constrained. Minor variations that had once gone unnoticed were now flagged during inspections. The environment became less tolerant of informal adaptation. In response, he reverted to standard procedure, documenting anomalies rather than attempting to mitigate them locally. This return to routine brought renewed frustration. Enemy interference appeared once more with regularity. Jamming coincided with established transmission windows. Intercepted signals were followed by enemy movement that aligned closely with Allied intentions, even when message content remained secure. At one point, a regional review questioned whether operators had compromised codes through error. The implication was subtle, but clear. Responsibility for exposure was being sought at the operational level, rather than within Doctrine. The specialist's logs, which showed consistent adherence to procedure alongside persistent interception, offered quiet contradiction, but no resolution. Institutional resistance became apparent. Acknowledging the full implications of traffic analysis would require retraining, procedural overhaul, and acceptance of earlier misjudgments. In a system under constant operational strain, such changes were difficult to justify. The specialist continued to perform his duties with care, aware that the limits he faced were structural rather than personal. His role placed him close to the problem, but far from authority. The gap between what was observed and what could be acted upon remained. As 1943 drew to a close, Allied preparations accelerated. Radio networks were reinforced, not fundamentally altered. The airwaves grew busier, not quieter. The vulnerability persisted, embedded in the routines that kept the war moving. In early 1944, as preparations for major Allied operations reached their final stages, institutional awareness of radio vulnerability had matured, though unevenly. Within select intelligence and planning circles, traffic analysis was no longer dismissed. It was recognized as a method by which an attentive enemy could infer intent without ever breaking a code. This understanding, however, translated into change only gradually. New directives were issued that framed radio use as something to be managed rather than simply executed. Certain units were instructed to introduce controlled variation into transmission schedules. Others were encouraged to employ deceptive traffic, broadcasting routine signals disconnected from actual movement. These measures were limited and carefully bounded, designed to coexist with existing doctrine rather than replace it. For the signals specialist, these changes arrived quietly. There was no acknowledgement of earlier warnings, no formal recognition of the observations logged over years. Instead, updated procedures appeared as neutral adjustments, attributed to evolving operational needs. He was instructed to follow revised timing windows and to assist in generating non-operational transmissions when required. The work remained routine, but its purpose had subtly shifted. Radio traffic was no longer assumed to be a neutral conduit. It was treated as a visible presence, something that could mislead as well as inform. The distinction between communication and deception became less rigid. Enemy interception did not cease, but its effectiveness appeared reduced in certain areas. Predictable patterns were broken intermittently. Not all losses could be prevented, and no single measure offered certainty. Still, the balance between exposure and control was more actively managed than before. After the major operations commenced, internal assessments noted that enemy responses were less consistent with anticipated Allied movements. These findings were cautiously worded, avoiding firm attribution. Traffic analysis was mentioned among several contributing factors, neither elevated nor ignored. The signal specialist remained in service through the latter stages of the war. His role did not change in title or status. He trained new operators, emphasizing accuracy and discipline, but also an awareness that radio presence itself carried meaning. This guidance was informal, passed through example rather than doctrine. When the war ended, communications practices were reviewed in broader terms. Manuals were revised. Training incorporated lessons about traffic patterns and behavioral signatures. These changes were institutional, detached from individual contributions. The specialist returned to civilian life without distinction. His logs were archived, his reports absorbed into a larger record. The work he had done was not remembered as an act of defiance or innovation, but as part of the slow accumulation of understanding that shaped safer communication. The legacy of those years lay not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in restraint. It was the recognition that even silence and routine could speak, and that in war, listening was often as decisive as speaking.